I'm Professor Ola Uduku, Research Professor in Architecture at Manchester School of Architecture, Manchester Metropolitan University. And myself and my colleague, who will introduce herself now, have been involved in the Lagos scoping case study.
And I'm Taibat Lawanson, Professor of Urban Management at the University of Lagos, and based in Lagos, and worked with Professor Uduku on the Lagos scoping study.
I guess what we could do is start a discussion about what we think the key takeaways are about the Lagos scoping study. And I think probably the major one will be that Lagos is certainly at the moment probably the largest urban conurbation, at least in West Africa, if not the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. And this is very important because we're talking about Lagos, which is described in different ways, which is what we found out indeed in terms of looking at the study. But generally, it is a city-state. It's the equivalent of something like New York would be, or possibly Mumbai is to India and so on. So it's got all the functions of a functioning small state, but it is also part of Nigeria. Despite no longer being the capital, it has a lot of the capital functions. And in terms of its, I guess, key issues, these are both local, to do with local issues, but also there's a lot that overlaps around the international nature of the city and its links globally. Would you agree, Taibat?
Yes, so Lagos definitely is practically the fastest growing and projected to be the fastest growing, in the coming years. And something that were able to, tease out was the complexity of the city really across all sectors, and even more importantly, with regards to how the people, the Lagosians interact with themselves and their government. So we see that, there are layers of formal and informal institutional structures that are working hand in hand and many times at cross purposes with each other.
Exactly. I mean, having looked at the structure of Lagos, this issue about governance, particularly, and the ways in which the city runs is, I guess, original and unique. There have been earlier studies done, but certainly a snapshot in 2020, 2021 shows very clearly the strength of these informal institutions, particularly in running at what at one level could look like an ungovernable space. So the informal institutions and informal authorities and powers are very critical in the ways in which the local Lagosian citizen engages with infrastructure and access to these services. And also, I guess we have to say that a significant proportion of Lagosians are living in conditions that are below, well, are in poor conditions. How all infrastructure is under pressure. And there is a small elite that can, I guess, survive reasonably well in the city. But for the majority of the population, most access to most infrastructure is a struggle. And the support that is being able to be given at, if you like, governmental and state level is limited. Over to you, Taibat. Yeah. You're back in darkness.
Sorry, well, African problems. So over 60% of the population of Lagos lives in informality, either living in informal slums or squatter settlements or working within the informal economic sector. Many of them, actually categorized as the dollar-a-day category, who live on, daily wages. But because the inequality in the city is so wide, we have this majority living side by side with, the very affluent neighbors, such as, those who, live in Ikoyi, and even some of the emerging man-made islands that, are jutting out over the city. So the formal, informal is also dictated by the socioeconomic dichotomy on the city, and the spatial manifestation of that is quite apparent. You have the gated communities on one end, and then the squatter settlements on the other end. But a lot of, the infrastructure in Lagos is self-provisioned. Take, for example, electricity. And I guess that is why, people are moving into these gated communities, because they offer some measure of comfort. People are able to self-provision while living with people who have similar socioeconomic circumstances to themselves. And, a lot of it also is caused by, perhaps we can't say caused by the movement of the city capital from Lagos to Abuja, but a lot of the infrastructure that was there when the city was Nigeria's capital moved to Abuja, and then there's that gap. So, Prof, perhaps you can talk about, the legal and institutional status of Lagos within the framework of Nigeria.
Okay. Yeah. So again, just giving a mini history lesson, Lagos, the colony of Lagos was actually founded in 1861. So it has actually had that kind of premier status for a long time in Nigeria's history. But from independence in 1960, in the case of Nigeria, right up until 1985-6, it was the designated federal capital territory of the country of Nigeria, the state of Nigeria. Abuja, which is now Nigeria's capital and the federal capital development area around it, has all ministries and so on, all the governance tools moved to Abuja in the late 80s to early 90s. And with that, a lot of the infrastructure that services these activities were also moved, and nothing was put in its place. So despite Lagos having a significant proportion of, what would I call it, large industries and so on, a lot of the infrastructure that serviced that, electricity, even telecommunications, moved when the government moved up to Abuja. And since then, really, the state of Lagos has had to play catch up in terms of providing infrastructure. But as I said earlier on, Lagos still remains the commercial capital of Nigeria, if not West Africa regionally. But the infrastructure to support that is very, very limited. And as Taibat has said, as we've alluded to, the difference between the rich and the poor is so much that I guess effectively it's acting, I guess, a bit like a Latin American city. There's a large amount of industry and development at one level, but there's a large amount of poverty. And the ways in which the legal structures deal with this is really to impose a kind of flat tax base and so on, which means that oftentimes those who could pay more tax are not paying more tax, and a lot cannot afford at all. And the legal tools do not make that distinction. And although there have been a series of developments around what is the territory and what is not, effectively there are layers and layers of governance, none of which can really oftentimes deliver to a small family in an informal community. The reality is often there's a much more informal structure of what would I call it, access to things like water, electricity. If you're rich, you might be in a gated community. If you're in an informal settlement, a group of, to be honest, young people might decide to tap electricity illegally, that kind of thing. So the ways in which access happens is not structured, and the governance structures that have been put in place have not been able to deliver, I would say, a clear method of transfer of power, information, or anything from the governance structures to the people. So it's a struggle.
Yes, and something else that we see now is the migration into the city. There's a lot of in-migration, apart from those who are coming in from Nigeria's hinterland. We also have, in the last 5 years, a lot of migration of internally displaced people fleeing the insecurity we have in Nigeria's northeast, who are dissatisfied with the conditions in the internally displaced persons camps, and so seek, their independent livelihoods elsewhere, away from the fighting and all of that. And for many of them, they choose Lagos because it's a big city, so it grants them some measure of anonymity, and it also allows them to pursue economic opportunities, no matter how basic. So we have this group of people coming into the city. We also have people coming in from the West African sub-region, particularly those seeking for informal trade, either as construction artisans or as domestic aids or as traders. So we have that category of people also coming in. And so the population has really grown over the years, and it doesn't seem to be abating anytime soon. So we have a relatively young population and largely unskilled, and that is actually a challenge for the city governance because of the types of jobs that are being taken up and the kinds of distortions that are occurring with, at variance to the laid down regulations or the state's economic development patterns and plans. So that's another thing about Lagos, particularly in recent times. And then I'd like to speak about the EndSARS. The EndSARS that occurred towards the end of 2020, when young people came together to protest police brutality and the general poor governance in the nation. And what happened was they congregated online because Twitter especially has become a space, where they mobilize, especially because of shrinking public spaces and perhaps because of the lack of physical spaces where people can gather. So during the EndSARS protest, they came together, and it was generally young people coming together to protest against poor governance, to protest against police brutality. And it was actually quite surprising how people were able to come together, articulate their needs and things like that. Another interesting thing that came from that manifestation of urban discontent is the use of technology. So there was a lot of like I said earlier, communication via social media, Twitter, and when they shut down on the financial transactions, a lot of the funds, resource mobilization was through cryptocurrency, and they were able to raise significant funds with which to help to pay medical bills, to feed those who were at the protest grounds and things like that. And so in thinking about, Lagos within these program, these ACRC projects, the political issues, and how it bleeds into other aspects of city growth and development, really come to light. And a major issue that we see as well is the issue of poor urban management. I guess, if the infrastructure in the city can only cater for 8 to 10 million and you have a population double that number, you're already in a crisis mode. But, the basic urban management practices, traffic management, waste disposal, disaster prevention, and things like that, they are insufficient, I believe, because of the population and then, limited resources of the government. And then when you compare it with the aspiration of the city to be a world-class city, whatever that means, you start to see the tensions around, what should the city government's priorities be, as against, what it currently is. What are the realities? What are the lived experiences of the citizenry? What are they going through? And then, juxtapose that against what is the government doing, to perhaps alleviate some of the suffering that people are going through in their everyday life. So that brings it up quite strongly that there's a need to look at the interface between the political priorities, of the government and, the lived realities of people, and seeking for perhaps a middle ground where government is able to achieve her aspirational objectives without necessarily doing harm to the rest of the citizenry.
One thing I would also say, though, is that I guess Lagos, like probably Accra, does actually have a reservoir pool of highly educated intellectuals. And I think there's that tension as well between indeed the government's ambitions and indeed what I would call an emerging critical mass of intelligentsia. So back to the ideas about what happened in NSAS and the use of fintech and cryptocurrencies. I guess one of my side issues is just looking at the economics and reading the Financial Times and so on. And the fintech industry in Nigeria in Lagos actually is considerable. And this is despite a lot of efforts by some governance structures to try and control it. So fintech in Lagos is actually much younger than fintech that's happening in East Africa and places like Nairobi and so on, but it's very well connected. And these, I guess, the intelligentsia or the emerging, what I'd say critical mass of middle class Nigerians have very strong links to particularly Western capital, to be honest. But how this then translates into more than really helping the NSAS movement and developing a city like Lagos is something that is a nexus that needs to be looked at. So in terms of, if you like, the traditional African city that one might be looking at with, I guess, major issues, in this case, a lot of the ability to deal with some of these, what we call wicked problems now in the West is there. But that, again, that interface between government and those who are able to work in that sphere causes a lot of tension. It's all very well to say, I don't know, Shomolu local government can do this, that, and the other, but in reality, Shomolu local government has very limited resources. It's still very much dependent on what's happening at a higher level. So this is the politics, and it may be a different politician in power, for example. And that comes to the other thing about the long-term ambitions, which Taibat has actually pointed out as well. If people are only in power for, is it 3 to 5 years, a lot of the politics, which I guess is the same in the West as well, is very much around what can I do during my time in power, and not the strategic development of a city like Lagos.
Yeah, so the local government, for example, are constitutionally, empowered to do a lot at the municipal level, but their finances used to come through the state government, so they're essentially, in reality, an appendage of the state government. In Lagos, we even have a Lagos State Ministry of Local Government Affairs, and all the 57 local government areas, 20 local government, 37 local council development areas are subject, to that ministry. The budgets of the various local governments gets passed by the State House of Assembly. And so the local government is incapacitated. And we saw this during COVID. A lot of the responses that were required at the community level were not efficient from the government side, because the local government that ought, to take control at that level simply did not have perhaps the technical capacity, but definitely they lacked the financial resources to take control at that level. And so there were gaps in messaging, there were gaps in distribution of support, and we call it palliatives here, the food support, especially for the vulnerable households. There were gaps in sensitization regarding keeping safe and all of that. There were gaps also in sensitization regarding vaccination that we see. So the strengthening the capacity of the local government is an urgent responsibility, and the new urban agenda, gives us that mandate. Nigeria is a signatory to that, as well as the SDG. So it's really something, that can change the political dynamics of the city, and if done properly, will definitely put, the city on a more positive, more sustainable trajectory.
To me, despite the problems of Lagos, it is a vibrant city. And I think it's moved a lot from being apparently what was called a hardship posting for expatriates. I think actually, despite the problems, it does seem as though Lagos and Johannesburg have become very strong business hubs. If you look at things like flights going backwards and forwards and where a lot of business is taking place, there's a lot going on in these commercial hubs. So that's Lagos, Johannesburg, and to a lesser extent, East Africa. But in terms of actual what I'd call economic development and not purely areas around, I guess, tourism and I'd say soft economics, it's still a very important contributor to well, certainly an African, West African economy that we really need to, I think it's important that it's one of the cities that we study at this ACRC level.
Yes, I'll second that, and also say that, the city, it's a city that continues to unravel, that continues to reinvent herself, so you have these, like I said earlier, aspirations to be world class, and that is what is pushing, the financial decisions, and also attracting investment, maybe not enough, but it is attracting investment, and maybe not the right type of investment, but some are definitely coming in. So on that part, there's a lot of activity going on, but on the other part, there's also a lot of activity going on at the micro scale with local communities, with startups, with NGOs, with activists, with people doing, small things and actually changing, making impact, I would say, at, those micro levels. I think it's really worth studying, because every time you come back, there's always something new to discover. And I think that's, really what, makes it an important case study or an important point to note. Lagos is reflective of the African dream. It was Jean-Paul Elongbasi, the Secretary General of the UCLGA, that said, if Nigeria gets it right, Africa will get it right. And more importantly, he said Lagos is the trigger for Nigeria. So it's important we take a closer look at Lagos, what's happening in Lagos, and how we can leverage what's happening in Lagos to push for a better continent.
Particularly for the poor and marginalized. So in some ways, those who have the wherewithal can always survive. But I think in terms of what Lagos represents, both in terms of its sheer population, its size, and so on, it really is a test case for, I would say, a lot of African cities in terms of what it represents.